The dust swirled around her ankles as she stood at the edge of Copper Canyon, her grandfather's treasured medicine pouch clutched in hands that bore the marks of hard labor. They called her half-blood behind her back and wouldn't look her in the eyes when she passed. Her mother's people had turned their backs, and her father's tribe didn't know she existed. Esperanza Garcia was a ghost caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Dawn painted the sky in bleeding colors as she gazed across the harsh landscape of Arizona Territory 1885. Her dark hair, unbound and wild, danced in the desert wind like a spirit refusing to be tamed. The small trading settlement of Mesa Roja was stirring behind her, smoke rising from chimneys as the townsfolk prepared for another day of pretending she wasn't there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Esperanza had stopped waiting for their acknowledgement years ago, but the ache remained, buried beneath her skin like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. The trading post bell rang in the distance, signaling the opening of the general store. Time to face another day of sideways glances and whispered judgments. She tucked the medicine pouch inside her faded cotton dress, the only connection to a heritage she knew through stories and dreams, and turned toward town. "There she goes," muttered Mrs. Caldwell, sweeping her porch as Esperanza passed. "That Apache girl with her strange ways." "Captain Garcia's biggest mistake," replied Mr. Thornton, loading supplies onto his wagon, "taking in that savage woman during the campaign. What did he expect would come of it?" Esperanza heard them clearly, but kept her eyes forward, spine straight as an arrow. Their words were familiar companions, as constant as the sun that scorched the canyon walls. The town of Mesa Roja had been built on silver dreams and stubborn determination. The mines had drawn fortune seekers from the east, while the military outpost kept a watchful eye on Apache territory beyond the ridge. It was a place where cultures collided, where Spanish names mixed with English on storefronts, where cavalry officers drank alongside miners. But it was not a place that tolerated the blending of bloodlines. Esperanza's mother, Nayeli, had been found badly wounded after a skirmish between army scouts and a band of Apaches. Captain Robert Garcia, newly arrived from Spain via Mexico and eager to prove his worth to the American military, had ordered her taken to the fort's infirmary rather than left to die. What began as duty transformed into something forbidden, a love that crossed boundaries neither culture would forgive. They married in secret, with only the fort's chaplain as witness. When Nayeli died giving birth to Esperanza, the town's sympathy for the widowed captain quickly soured to judgment. Robert Garcia raised his daughter with fierce love and protection until typhoid took him when Esperanza was 16. Now, at 20, she survived on whatever work she could find, mending clothes, tending gardens, collecting herbs from the canyon for the reluctant town healer. She approached the general store, waiting until the initial morning rush subsided, before entering. Inside, Mr. Wallace busied himself behind the counter, suddenly fascinated by his inventory ledger, as the bell above the door announced her arrival. "Morning, Mr. Wallace," she said, voice soft but clear. "I've brought the herbs Mrs. Peterson requested for her tinctures." Wallace grunted without looking up. "Leave them on the counter. She'll pay you next time she comes in." She said the same. "Last week, sir. I haven't been paid for the last 3 collections." Wallace finally glanced up, irritation flashing across his weathered face. "Might be because folks are talking about those plants you gather. Say you're muttering Apache curses over them before you bring them in." Esperanza's expression didn't change, though something cold slid down her spine. "That's not true." "Don't much matter what's true, does it? It's what people believe." He returned to his ledger. "I'll tell her you came by." She left the carefully, bundled herbs on the counter and departed, knowing she'd never see payment. Outside, the morning had fully bloomed, harsh sunlight bouncing off the red clay buildings that gave Mesa Roja its name. She headed toward the churchyard, where the only steady work she could find awaited. Father Domingo paid her a small sum to tend the church grounds and clean the modest chapel each week. Unlike most in town, he treated her with basic dignity, though his kindness remained cautious, always within the boundaries of what his congregation would tolerate. "Ah, Esperanza," he called as she approached. The elderly priest was attempting to move a fallen branch from the pathway. "Thank heaven you've come. These old bones aren't what they used to be." She hurried forward, easily lifting the branch. "You should have waited, Father. You'll hurt your back again." "When you reach my age, child, everything hurts whether you do something or not," he smiled wearily. "The inside needs sweeping and the altar cloths need washing. The bishop is coming next month. I'll take care of it." She moved toward the small shed where cleaning supplies were kept, but he gently touched her arm. "Esperanza, there's something you should know." His voice lowered. "The church council met yesterday. Some members expressed concerns about your continued employment here." She stilled, face carefully blank. "What concerns?" "Foolish ones," he sighed. "Mrs. Thornton suggested that having someone of your background tending sacred spaces might be inappropriate. She mentioned finding you once with that leather pouch of yours, the one that belonged to your grandfather. It contains sage and cedar, nothing more." Her voice remained steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "I know this, but they've convinced themselves you're practicing some form of pagan ritual on church grounds." He looked genuinely troubled. "I defended you, of course, but I'm just one voice. And they're the ones who pay for the new roof," she finished for him. Father Domingo had the grace to look ashamed. "They've given me until the end of the month to find a replacement." "I'm sorry, Esperanza." She nodded once, face composed even as another small piece of her world crumbled away. "I understand. I'll finish today's work." "You're a good person," he said softly. "Your father was a man of faith. He would be proud of your dignity. But dignity didn't fill an empty stomach or patch a leaking roof." As she swept the church floor, Esperanza calculated how long her meager savings might last. Without the church, work and the herb money, her options in Mesa Roja were vanishing like water in the desert. The day stretched on beneath the merciless Arizona sun. After finishing at the church, she walked to the edge of town where Dr. Sullivan's house stood. The physician's wife occasionally hired her to help with laundry, not because she needed help, but out of some misplaced Christian charity that required regular reminders of her own generosity. Mrs. Sullivan answered the door with her usual pinched smile. "Esperanza, it's Wednesday already." "Yes, ma'am, for the laundry?" "Oh." She glanced behind her, hesitating. "Well, I've already started it myself. There isn't much this week." Esperanza recognized the lie. Through the doorway she could see a substantial pile of dirty linens in the washing basket. "I see. Perhaps next week, then." "Perhaps." Mrs. Sullivan began closing the door, then paused. "Actually, Esperanza, I've been thinking it might be best if we made a change. The ladies at the auxiliary have suggested that Clara Willoughby's daughter might need the work more. A respectable girl from a good family, you understand. The dismissal was gentler than most, but it cut just as deep." "Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. Thank you for the opportunity you've provided." As the door closed, Esperanza remained composed, turning away with measured steps, as though this wasn't one more severed lifeline. She walked toward the town's outskirts, where her small cabin stood on the piece of land her father had purchased years ago, a plot no one else had wanted due to the rocky soil and distance from town. The cabin was modest, but solidly built, one of the few things her father had left her besides his name and the mixed blood that made her an outcast. Inside, she moved methodically through her evening routine, lighting the stove, preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, checking the roof where last week's rain had found a new path inside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As darkness fell, she sat on the porch step, watching stars emerge above the canyon ridges. From a distance came the sounds of Mesa Roja's saloon, piano music, laughter, the occasional shout. A community sharing life's moments, both bitter and sweet, while she sat alone in the gathering dark. She reached into her dress and withdrew the medicine pouch, opening it carefully. Inside lay a small bundle of sage, a piece of white shell, and a carved wooden symbol her mother had made, a family marking, her father had explained once. The symbol of her mother's people, though he'd known little else about it. Esperanza had no memories of her mother, only the stories her father had told, with a mixture of love and grief in his voice. How Nayeli had been fierce and gentle in equal measure. How she had learned English with remarkable speed, adapting to life at the fort while maintaining the quiet dignity of her heritage. How she had sung ancient songs to her swelling belly, promising her unborn child that two worlds would mean twice the strength, not half of each, a promise that had proven false in the harsh reality of frontier prejudice. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Esperanza from her thoughts. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. She tucked the medicine pouch away and stood, peering into the darkness beyond her small property. A lone rider approached, the silhouette unfamiliar against the star-scattered sky. The horse moved with purpose, not the casual meandering of someone lost. As they drew closer, she could make out a man's form sitting tall in the saddle, head covered by a wide-brimmed hat. Not one of the townspeople. She knew all their outlines by heart. The stranger stopped a respectful distance from her cabin. "Evening," he called, voice carrying clearly through the night air. "Might I trouble you for some water, for my horse and myself?" His accent wasn't local. Something Eastern in his vowels, perhaps Boston or New York, but weathered by years away. From its source. The well's around back," she answered cautiously. "You're welcome to water your horse." He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone at home in the saddle, despite his Eastern speech. As he led his horse toward the well, lamplight from her cabin window caught his profile. A man perhaps in his 30s, features sharp and weathered by sun and wind. "You're a good distance from town," she observed, maintaining her position on the porch, intentionally so. He allowed his horse to drink deeply from the trough. "I find the welcome at most frontier establishments depends greatly on who you are and where you come from." The statement carried a weight of personal experience that resonated uncomfortably with her own. Now that he stood in the faint light, she could see his clothing was an unusual mixture. Eastern-cut trousers and vest, but with leather leggings similar to those worn by Apache scouts. His skin was deeply tanned, making his heritage difficult to determine in the dim light. "You're traveling through?" she asked, remaining vigilant. A woman alone learned caution early, especially one with no protectors in the community. Returning, actually. He filled a canteen from the well, movements deliberate and calm. "This territory holds memories for me. Most memories around here aren't worth returning for." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Some are." He drank from the canteen, then secured it to his saddle. "You're Captain Garcia's daughter." It wasn't a question. Esperanza's posture stiffened. "How would you know that?" "I recognize this place. Your father built it 15 years ago. I helped set the cornerstone." She studied him more carefully now. "You knew my father?" "I did. My name is Thomas Redhawk." He removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "Though when your father knew me, I was called Thomas Kitson." The name meant nothing to her, but something about his presence, the confident way he occupied space, the directness of his gaze, stirred a memory of her father's stories. Tales of a young army interpreter who had bridged worlds, who had helped Robert Garcia communicate with Nayeli during those first difficult weeks. "You were at the fort," she said slowly, "during the Apache campaigns." "I was." He replaced his hat. "I've been away a long time. Harvard University, then Europe. I've only recently returned to the territory." "Why come here? To this cabin?" His expression changed subtly, something unreadable passing across his features. "To fulfill a promise made long ago." Before she could question him further, the distant sound of horses approaching from the direction of town caught their attention. Multiple riders, moving quickly. Thomas Redhawk tensed, head turning toward the sound. "Are you expecting visitors, Miss Garcia?" "No." Apprehension slid cold fingers down her spine. Late-night visitors rarely brought good news, especially to her door. "Then I suggest you step inside." His posture had shifted, alert and wary as a mountain lion sensing danger. "Some promises are claimed sooner than expected." The riders were close enough now that their voices carried on the night air. The unmistakable, slurred shouts of men, emboldened by whiskey and bad intentions. Sheriff Jenkins led the group, though his presence offered no comfort. The law in Mesa protected those who belonged, not those who existed on the margins. "Get inside, Miss Garcia," Thomas repeated, no longer a suggestion but a quiet command. "This doesn't need to involve you." But Esperanza remained on her porch, spine straight, face composed. This was her home, built by her father's hands. She would not hide within it like a frightened child. "You're wrong, Mr. Redhawk," she replied, voice steady despite the approaching danger. "Whatever brings them here in the darkness, it has always involved me." He studied her for a moment, something like recognition flashing in his eyes. Then he nodded once and turned to face the oncoming riders, positioning himself between them and her porch. The gesture was subtle but clear, a boundary drawn, a protection offered. Esperanza watched as the riders appeared from the darkness, dust rising beneath their horses' hooves like specters from the earth. Whatever came next would change everything. She felt it with the same certainty that desert creatures feel an approaching storm. The storm had a name tonight. It had found her at last. Sheriff Jenkins pulled his horse to a stop 20 paces from the cabin, the animal's flanks heaving from the hard ride. Behind him, 5 men fanned out in a loose semicircle. Thornton from the mercantile, Wallace from the general store, the Prescott brothers who worked the Henderson silver claim, and young Billy Harding, whose father owned the saloon, Moonlight. Glinted off the badges pinned to Jenkins' vest, a symbol of authority that had never represented protection for Esperanza. "Evening, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice carrying an educated calm that seemed oddly misplaced against the tension crackling through the night air. He remained positioned between the riders and the porch, one hand resting casually on his saddle, the other hanging loose at his side. "Something I can help you with?" Jenkins's eyes narrowed as he assessed the stranger, taking in the unusual combination of Eastern refinement and frontier practicality in his attire. "This doesn't concern you, mister. Our business is with the Garcia woman." "That's so." Thomas shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but changing the angle of his stance. "Must be urgent business to bring 6 men riding out after dark." "I don't believe I caught your name," Jenkins replied, ignoring the observation. "Thomas Redhawk, recently returned from back east." A ripple of reaction passed through the group of men. Wallace leaned forward in his saddle. "Redhawk? That's some kind of Indian name?" "Apache, on my mother's side." Thomas delivered the information without defensiveness or apology, simply stating, "Fact. Harvard educated on my father's side. I find the combination serves me well in various circles." Jenkins' hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. "Well, Mr. Redhawk, as I said, our business is with Miss Garcia. There's been a theft in town. Silver flatware missing from the Sullivan home. Mrs. Sullivan reports that the Garcia woman was there today, supposedly looking for work. Esperanza stepped forward, her voice steady despite the accusation. "I never entered their house, Sheriff. Mrs. Sullivan spoke to me at the door, then sent me away." "That's not how she tells it," Thornton interjected, words slightly slurred. "Says she caught you in the dining room, standing over the silver cabinet. Says when she confronted you, you ran." "That's a lie." Esperanza's hands clenched at her sides, but her voice remained controlled. "I haven't set foot inside that house in weeks." Thomas glanced back at her briefly, then returned his attention to the men. "Seems like a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up in the morning, at the sheriff's office perhaps, instead of on a private doorstep after dark." "We're not waiting till morning," Jenkins stated flatly. "Mrs. Sullivan is beside herself. Flatware belonged to her grandmother, apparently. We're here to search the premises and recover the stolen property." "Do you have a warrant, Sheriff?" Thomas asked, his Boston-influenced accent becoming more pronounced as he adopted a lawyer's precision. Jenkins' expression hardened. "Don't need one. This is territorial justice, not some Eastern courthouse." "Interesting perspective," Thomas maintained his position. "However, Arizona Territory adopted common law procedures in 1864, which would indeed require a warrant to search a private residence without the owner's consent." The unexpected legal knowledge caused Jenkins to hesitate. Billy Harding, youngest and most impulsive of the group, growled with impatience. "We don't need papers to search an Indian thief's shack." "She's not Indian, she's half-breed," Thornton corrected with casual cruelty. "And this land technically belongs to the U.S. government anyway." "Actually," Thomas countered smoothly, "this parcel was deeded to Captain Robert Garcia by territorial grant in 1870, in recognition of his military service. I've recently reviewed the documentation at the Territorial Land Office in Prescott. His daughter's ownership is quite securely established." The precision of this information caused another ripple of uncertainty among the men. Jenkins scowled, uncomfortable with having his authority challenged so articulately. "Look here, Red Hawk, or whatever your name is, this doesn't concern you. Step aside and let us conduct our business, or I'll have to consider you an accessory after the fact." Thomas smiled thinly. "An interesting charge, considering no crime has been proven. I wonder how that would stand up before Territorial Judge Morrison next month. He's an acquaintance of mine from Harvard. We correspond regularly. The strategic dropping of names and connections had its intended effect." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The Prescott brothers exchanged glances, suddenly less certain about their night's mission. Esperanza watched the exchange with growing amazement. No one in Mesa Roja had ever challenged Jenkins so directly, especially not on her behalf. Thomas Redhawk moved and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating multiple worlds and making each one bend to his will. "Sheriff," Thomas continued in a reasonable tone, "I suggest we resolve this simply. I'll personally accompany Miss Garcia to your office first thing tomorrow morning, where Mrs. Sullivan can present her accusations in a proper legal setting. If any evidence exists, you can proceed accordingly. And if we don't agree to your suggestion," Jenkins asked, though some of the earlier aggression had leached from his voice. Thomas's posture remained relaxed, but something shifted in his eyes. "Then I'd be forced to send a detailed account of tonight's proceedings to both Judge Morrison and Governor Zulik, with whom I've been corresponding regarding educational initiatives for territorial indigenous populations." The mention of the governor visibly startled Jenkins. Billy Harding spat in the dust. "You expect us to believe some half-breed Harvard man has the ear of the governor?" Thomas reached slowly into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper, which he held up so. The official seal was visible in the moonlight. "Special Envoy to the Territorial Indigenous Affairs Commission, appointed by the governor himself. I'd be happy to show you the full documentation in better light." The atmosphere shifted palpably. What had begun as a drunken pursuit of easy justice against a defenseless target had transformed into a potentially complicated political situation. Jenkins cleared his throat. "No need for all that government business. If you're vouching for her appearance tomorrow, that's good enough. For tonight." He straightened in his saddle, attempting to reclaim some authority. 8 o'clock sharp at my office, Miss Garcia. We'll sort this out proper." Thomas nodded once. "We'll be there." Jenkins turned his horse, gesturing for the others to follow. Billy Harding looked ready to protest, but held his tongue when Thornton shook his head in warning. The group retreated. Into the darkness, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the night. Esperanza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They'll be back. Maybe not tonight, but Jenkins won't forget being challenged. "No, he won't," Thomas agreed, watching until the last rider disappeared into the darkness. Men like that rarely do. He turned to face her fully for the first time since the confrontation began. In the silver light of the moon, the planes of his face were sharply defined, revealing features that bridged two worlds. The high cheekbones and straight nose that spoke of his Apache heritage, combined with an expression shaped by years of Eastern education and refinement. "You actually know the governor?" she asked, still processing the exchange she had witnessed. A smile touched his lips. "I've met him twice. The special envoy appointment is real enough, though perhaps not quite as influential as I implied. And Judge Morrison from Harvard, my father's second cousin, though we've never actually met." He shrugged slightly. "In my experience, the suggestion of connections often proves more immediately useful than the connections themselves. Despite everything," Esperanza found herself smiling. "You're a very unusual man, Mr. Redhawk." "Thomas, please." He retrieved his canteen from his saddle, taking a drink before offering it to her. "And unusual circumstances require unusual approaches." She accepted the canteen, the water cool and welcome against her dry throat. "Why did you help me? You don't know me." "I knew your father. I knew your mother briefly." Something shifted in his expression. "And I made a promise." "What promise?" "What?" Thomas reclaimed the canteen, securing it to his saddle before answering. "It's a long story, best told when we're not expecting the sheriff to change his mind and return with reinforcements." He glanced toward the cabin. "May I suggest we continue this conversation inside? The night has cooled considerably." Esperanza hesitated, inviting a man, a stranger, regardless of his timely assistance, into her home at night violated every standard of propriety she'd been raised with. Yet there was something about Thomas Redhawk that commanded trust, a sense of honor that radiated from him as naturally as heat from desert stone. "Very well," she decided, turning toward the cabin. "But I want answers, not more mysteries." The interior of the cabin was modest, but meticulously maintained. A small fire burned in the stone hearth, casting warm light across the simple furnishings. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, a curtained alcove presumably concealing a bed. Books lined a rough-hewn shelf, surprising in both number and variety for a frontier home. Thomas noted several volumes in Spanish alongside English texts on botany, medicine, and history. "My father believed education was the great equalizer," Esperanza explained, following his gaze to the books. "He taught me to read in both languages before I was 6. "Captain Garcia was a man of unusual foresight," Thomas replied, remaining standing until she gestured toward one of the chairs at the table. "Many in his position would have considered such education wasted on a daughter, especially a half Apache daughter," she added without self-pity, simply stating reality as she lit the oil lamp on the table. "Please sit. Would you like coffee? It's not fresh, but I can heat it." "Thank you, no." He removed his hat, revealing thick black hair cut shorter than Apache tradition, but longer than Eastern fashion. Another bridge between worlds. I don't want to impose on your hospitality more than necessary. She took the chair opposite him, posture straight, eyes direct. In the lamplight, Thomas could see the clear inheritance of both her bloodlines, her father's strong Spanish features, softened by her mother's Apache influence, creating a striking beauty that defied easy categorization. "You said you knew my parents," she prompted. "How?" Thomas rested his hands on the table, considering his words carefully. "I was 16 when I was assigned to Fort Bowie as an interpreter. My father was a Boston linguistics professor who had married an Apache woman while researching indigenous languages. I grew up speaking both Apache and English, making me valuable to the army despite my age and mixed blood." "You worked for the army against your mother's people?" The question held. "No judgment, only curiosity," I translated, he clarified. "Sometimes between army officers and Apache leaders during peace talks, sometimes between soldiers and Apache prisoners. I told myself I was helping prevent bloodshed through understanding. Perhaps that was self-deception." He paused, seeming to look beyond the cabin walls to a past still vivid in his memory. "Your father arrived at the fort in 1864, a Spanish officer who had pledged allegiance to the American government, eager to prove himself. When army scouts brought in a wounded Apache woman after a skirmish, he ordered her treated rather than left to die or executed as many would have done. My mother," Esperanza said softly. Thomas nodded. "Nayeli. She was from the Chiricahua band. Proud, fierce, but also pragmatic. She understood that survival sometimes required adaptation. How did you come to know her?" "I was called to translate once she regained consciousness. She was suspicious at first. An Apache boy working for the white soldiers was hardly trustworthy in her eyes, but eventually she came to accept my presence." His expression softened at the memory. "Your father visited her daily, initially to check on the army's prisoner, but soon for less official reasons. He asked me to teach him basic Apache phrases. I watched an impossible connection form between them, against every social boundary. Of the time, Esperanza's fingers unconsciously reached for the medicine pouch concealed in her dress. He told me they married in secret. They did. The fort chaplain performed the ceremony with only myself and the doctor as witnesses. Your father knew his military career would end if the marriage became widely known, but he refused to dishonor Nayeli by taking her as anything less than a wife." "What happened after I was born? After she died?" The questions emerged quietly, touching on the void that had shaped her entire existence. Thomas's expression grew solemn. "Your father was devastated. He requested a transfer to this region, away from Fort Bowie and its memories. By then, I had received an opportunity to attend School in the East, a missionary program for promising native youths willing to embrace education and Christianity." "You left Arizona?" "For almost 20 years. He nodded. "First preparatory school, then Harvard, then legal studies. I traveled in Europe, worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington. I became what the Eastern establishment calls a credit to my race, the acceptable face of indigenous advancement." There was a subtle bitterness in the last words, quickly masked as he continued. "Before I left, your father asked me to make him a promise. He knew his position as a widowed officer with a mixed-blood child was precarious. He feared what might happen to you if something befell him." "What was the promise?" Esperanza asked, though something within her already sensed the answer. "That if he died before you reached adulthood, I would return and ensure you weren't alone. In a world that would judge you for bloodlines beyond your control." Thomas met her gaze directly. "I learned of his death 3 years ago, but my position with the Indian Affairs Commission prevented my immediate return. When my appointment ended, 6 months ago, I made my way back to the territory." Esperanza absorbed this information silently. The idea that her father had secured a protector for her, someone who understood the complexity of straddling two worlds, was both comforting and strange. That this protection had arrived years after. She had learned to survive on her own stirred, complicated emotions. "I've managed thus far," she said finally. "As you can see, I have my father's home, his books. I've found ways to survive." "Survival isn't the same as living," Thomas observed quietly. "And from what I witnessed tonight, your position in Mesa Roja grows more precarious by the day." "The silver theft accusation is false," she stated firmly. "Sheriff Jenkins will find nothing tomorrow because there's nothing to find." "Truth rarely matters in situations like this," Thomas replied, his voice gentle but unflinching. "Mrs. Sullivan has decided you're guilty, and the town is eager to agree. The sheriff isn't looking for evidence. He's looking for confirmation of what he already believes." The stark assessment hung in the air between them. Esperanza had harbored no illusions about her standing in Mesa Roja, but hearing it articulated so plainly brought its full weight to bear. "What would you suggest, then?" she asked. "That I simply abandon my father's home? The only place I've ever known." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that commanded attention. "I suggest you consider that your father built this place as shelter, not as a prison. He wanted you to have roots, yes, but also wings. Poetic metaphors won't change the reality of my situation, Mr. Redhawk." "No," he agreed with unexpected frankness, "but perhaps I can. Tomorrow we'll face the sheriff and his false accusations. And after that, I'd like to show you something beyond Mesa Roja, something that might offer a different perspective on your heritage and your future." The proposal hung between them, laden with possibilities both promising and uncertain. Outside, the desert night deepened, stars wheeling overhead in ancient patterns that had guided travelers long before either Spanish conquistadors or American settlers had claimed these lands. Esperanza studied the man across from her. This bridge between worlds who had appeared at her door like a figure from her father's stories. She had learned early that trust was a luxury rarely afforded to those of mixed blood. Yet something about Thomas Redhawk's direct gaze and forthright manner pushed against her carefully constructed defenses. First, the sheriff, she decided, neither accepting nor rejecting his broader proposition. "We'll face one storm before considering the next." Thomas nodded, respect evident in his expression. "A wise approach. Dawn comes early. You should rest while you can." He rose from the chair, replacing his hat with a fluid motion that spoke of ingrained courtly manners. "I'll make camp near your corral, if that's acceptable, close enough to discourage any midnight return visits from our friends, but respecting proper boundaries." Esperanza walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him leave, despite the propriety of the arrangement. At the threshold, he paused, turning back to her with an expression that had shifted from diplomatic neutrality to something more personal. "Your father called you his bridge between worlds," Thomas said quietly. "He believed you embodied the best of both bloodlines, not diluted by mixing, but strengthened, like steel forged from different metals." The words touched something deep within her, a hunger for belonging that she had suppressed for years beneath the practical demands of survival. "Thank you for telling me that," she replied, voice steady despite the emotion those words evoked. "Good night, Mr. Redhawk." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "After all, we face the sheriff together in the morning." She nodded once, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Good night, Thomas." As he disappeared into the darkness beyond her porch, Esperanza closed the door and leaned against it, heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. The night had brought danger, yes, but also something unexpected, a glimpse of possibilities beyond the narrow confines of Mesa Roja, where her mixed blood might be seen as strength rather than shame. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for the first time in years, Esperanza found herself looking toward the future with something that felt dangerously like hope. The sheriff's office was a narrow adobe building wedged between the assayer's office and the telegraph station. Its windows were grimy with desert dust. The wooden sign above the door faded from years of relentless sun. Inside, the space was divided into a front office with a scarred desk and 3 holding cells behind an iron-barred door. A blunt announcement of Mesa Roja's approach to justice. Esperanza and Thomas arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. She wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once belonged to the doctor's wife before being passed down as charity. Her hair was pulled back severely, her posture a fortress. Thomas stood beside her in a clean white shirt under his vest, his manner relaxed but alert, like a mountain lion at rest, but fully aware of its surroundings. Sheriff Jenkins looked up from his paperwork with a scowl that deepened when he saw them. The night's sleep had apparently done nothing to improve his disposition. Mrs. Sullivan sat primly on a bench against the wall, her husband standing protectively behind her. Her pinched expression suggested someone who had committed fully to a course of action and would not be swayed by mere facts. "Right on time," Jenkins acknowledged grudgingly. "Mrs. Sullivan has formally filed a complaint against you, Miss Garcia, for the theft of a silver serving set valued at $75. I did not take anything from the Sullivan home," Esperanza stated clearly. "As I told you last night, I was not permitted past the doorway." Mrs. Sullivan made a sound of indignation. "That is absolutely false. I caught her in my dining room, standing over the silver cabinet. When confronted, she ran out the back door." "That's impossible," Esperanza replied evenly. "I've never even seen your dining room, Mrs. Sullivan." Thomas stepped forward. "Sheriff, has the stolen property been recovered?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet. We conducted a search of Miss Garcia's cabin early this morning without a warrant or her presence." Thomas interrupted, his voice sharp. "As I said last night, territorial justice works differently out here. The stolen goods weren't found, but that doesn't mean she didn't hide them elsewhere or pass them to an accomplice." "An accomplice?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And who might that be?" "Miss Garcia is notably isolated in this community." Dr. Sullivan cleared his throat. "If I may suggest, Sheriff, perhaps this gentleman is himself involved. His convenient arrival coincides with the theft." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Dr. Sullivan, I arrived in Mesa Roja yesterday after an extended journey from Tucson. Several passengers from the stage can verify my arrival time, as can the proprietor of the hotel where I initially inquired about lodging." "This is getting us nowhere," Jenkins grumbled. "Mrs. Sullivan is a respected member of this community. If she says she saw Miss Garcia in her home, then that's what happened." "I understand your position, Sheriff," Thomas replied, his tone shifting to one of reasonable compromise. "However, I wonder if there might be another explanation worth considering." "Such as?" Jenkins asked skeptically. "Mrs. Sullivan," Thomas addressed her directly, "you mentioned that Miss Garcia ran out the back door when confronted. Did you actually see her face clearly?" Mrs. Sullivan blinked, momentarily flustered. "Well, I recognized her. Dress and her general appearance." "Her general appearance," Thomas repeated thoughtfully. "Her height, her build, perhaps her coloring, characteristics that might be shared by others?" "What are you implying?" Dr. Sullivan demanded. "Simply that mistaken identity is more common than deliberate false accusation," Thomas replied smoothly. "Mrs. Sullivan believes she saw Miss Garcia. I suggest she saw someone else with similar physical characteristics who took advantage of Miss Garcia's reputation in town to commit this crime. The suggestion hung in the air, offering Mrs. Sullivan a graceful way to retreat without admitting malice. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she calculated the social implications of various responses. "I suppose," she said finally, "it is possible that in my distress I might have been mistaken about the specific identity of the intruder. The light in the dining room was rather poor, and I only caught a glimpse before she, or whoever it was, fled." Jenkins frowned. "So you're withdrawing your complaint?" "Not the theft," she clarified quickly. "The silver is definitely missing, but perhaps I was hasty in my identification of the culprit." Thomas nodded respectfully. "A very reasonable clarification, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm sure the sheriff will pursue all possible leads to recover your family heirloom." Jenkins looked as though he'd bitten into something sour. The neat resolution deprived him of the easy target he'd anticipated. "Fine, Miss Garcia, you're free to go, but don't leave the area. This investigation remains open." Outside in the harsh morning light, Esperanza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was unexpected. People like Mrs. Sullivan value their social standing," Thomas observed. "When faced with the choice between admitting a potentially embarrassing mistake or pursuing an unjust accusation, I gambled she would choose the former." "You didn't believe her withdrawal was sincere?" "Not remotely." His mouth curved in a humorless smile. "But sincerity matters less than official record. She can continue to believe whatever she wishes, but she can no longer legally pursue you for this particular accusation." They walked down the dusty main street, aware of curious glances from shopkeepers and morning customers. News traveled quickly in Mesa Roja, and the sight of Esperanza Garcia walking freely after a theft accusation, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger who was clearly part Apache, generated considerable speculation. "You mentioned showing me something beyond Mesa Roja," she said quietly as they passed the general store. "Was that merely a stratagem to keep me calm last night, or did you mean it?" Thomas slowed his pace, studying her with those direct, assessing eyes. "I meant every word. The question is whether you're willing to venture beyond these boundaries you've accepted." "They weren't boundaries I chose," she reminded him. "No, but they've become familiar. Sometimes the known hardship feels safer than the unknown possibility." He glanced toward the livery stable. "I have horses ready. We can be back before nightfall." Esperanza hesitated. She had responsibilities, meager as they were. Chickens to feed, garden to tend. More importantly, leaving town with a man, even one who had proven honorable thus far, would further damage her already precarious reputation. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas added, "We'll be traveling to the mission at San Xavier. Father Domingo can accompany us if propriety concerns you." The suggestion surprised her. "Father Domingo? You've spoken with him this morning, while you prepared for our meeting with the sheriff. He expressed concern for your situation and agreed that a temporary absence from Mesa Roja might be beneficial. Given recent events, the careful planning impressed and unsettled her in equal measure." Thomas Redhawk moved through the world with deliberate purpose, arranging circumstances to his advantage, like a chess player thinking several moves ahead. "What's at San Xavier that's so important?" she asked. "Not what," he replied. "Who?" The mission of San Xavier del Bac rose from the desert like a white mirage, its ornate Spanish colonial architecture dramatically contrasting with the rugged landscape surrounding it. Founded by Jesuit missionaries in the late 17th century, it had stood as a crossroads of cultures for generations: Spanish, Mexican, Tohono O'odham, and now American. Father Domingo rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks as they traveled the 20 miles southwest from Mesa Roja. Thomas and Esperanza followed on horses from the livery, their pace steady across terrain that alternated between rocky outcroppings and stretches of mesquite-dotted flatland. The mission As extensive records, Father Domingo explained as the White Towers came into view. Births, deaths, marriages, documentation that spans nearly 2 centuries. The Jesuits were meticulous record keepers. Esperanza glanced at Thomas, questioning. He had revealed little about their purpose during the journey, deflecting her inquiries, with observations about the landscape or questions about her knowledge of local plant life. Father Kino began mission work with the indigenous peoples long before American settlers arrived. Thomas finally explained. The Spanish approach to the native populations differed significantly from later American policies. There was greater integration, shall we say. You mean they weren't as concerned about mixed bloodlines? Esperanza translated bluntly. Thomas's mouth quirked slightly. Exactly. The Spanish Empire's approach to conquest included assimilation through intermarriage, creating generations of mixed heritage families throughout this region. They reached the mission by midday. The white walls gleamed painfully bright in the sun, the elaborate carved entrance offering blessed shade as they dismounted and tied their horses. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately. The thick adobe walls providing natural cooling. A robed Franciscan brother greeted Father Domingo warmly, eyeing the visitors with polite curiosity. After a brief explanation, he led them through the main sanctuary, its walls covered with vibrant murals of saints and biblical scenes, and into a small chamber behind the altar that served as an archive. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers and stacks of yellowing documents. A table stood in the center, illuminated by light from a high window. The room smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint sweetness of decaying leather. "The materials you inquired about, Mr. Redhawk," the brother said, gesturing to several volumes already laid out on the table. "Dating from 1840 through 1870 as requested. Thank you, Brother Miguel. Your assistance is deeply appreciated." The Franciscan bowed slightly. "Father Domingo mentioned you'd be working through the mealtime. I'll have food brought when the brothers take their dinner." After he departed, Father Domingo settled into a chair in the corner, pulling out a breviary for his afternoon prayers. Thomas turned to Esperanza, who stood uncertainly near the doorway. "Please," he said, gesturing to the table, "these records may help you understand not just your own history, but the complex tapestry of this region's peoples." Esperanza approached the table cautiously. The open ledger displayed neat handwriting in faded brown ink, recording baptisms performed in 1845. Names filled the columns, Spanish surnames followed by given names, with notations about parentage and godparents. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked. Thomas pulled another ledger forward. "Context, history, proof that you are not an anomaly or a mistake, but part of a continuum that stretches back generations." He turned pages carefully until reaching an entry from 1862. "Here, Maria Elena Vasquez, daughter of Colonel Sebastian Vasquez and Luisa Altaja, India de la Nación Apache." Esperanza leaned closer. The entry clearly documented the baptism of a child born to a Spanish military officer and an Apache woman, with no indication of scandal or irregularity in the phrasing. "There are hundreds of similar records," Thomas continued, turning more pages. "Spanish soldiers, ranchers and traders who married indigenous women. Their children grew up with dual heritage, many becoming prominent citizens despite, or perhaps because of, their mixed bloodline. This was before the American presence," she noted. "Yes, but the pattern continued." He moved to another volume from 1867. After American acquisition of the territory, attitudes began to shift, but not overnight. "Your parents' marriage in 1864 was unusual, but not unprecedented." Esperanza traced the names with her fingertip, feeling a strange connection to these unknown predecessors who had navigated the complicated waters of dual identity before her. This is fascinating history, but how does it help my present situation? Thomas's expression grew more intent. Turn to the final page of the baptismal record from 1865. She did as instructed, finding an entry that made her breath catch. Esperanza Nayeli Garcia, daughter of Captain Robert Garcia and Nayeli of the Chiricahua Apache. Her own baptismal record, written in the same matter-of-fact script as all the others. Keep reading, Thomas urged quietly. Her eyes moved to the column listing godparents, and she froze. Godfather Thomas Kitson, interpreter. Godmother Mariana Robles, midwife. She looked up at Thomas, startled. You're my godfather? In the Catholic tradition, yes. His expression remained carefully neutral. Your father asked me to stand as spiritual guardian during your baptism. I was 17, hardly qualified for such responsibility, but in frontier circumstances, options were limited. You never mentioned this last night. I thought it best to establish a foundation of trust based on current actions rather than past connections you couldn't verify. He met her gaze directly. A godparent makes vows to help guide and protect their godchild in spiritual matters. When I left for the East, your father expanded that promise to include more worldly protections, if needed. Father Domingo looked up from his prayers. The bond of godparenthood is sacred, Esperanza. In many communities, it creates a relationship, nearly as binding as blood kinship. Esperanza struggled to absorb this new dimension of her connection to Thomas. The revelation explained his sense of obligation, his timely return, but it also raised new questions about his ultimate intentions. There's more, Thomas said, pulling forward another document. Not a bound ledger this time, but a collection of loose papers tied with faded ribbon. These are correspondence and legal documents from Captain Garcia's military service and subsequent civilian life. He untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded a crisp document bearing official seals. This is your father's land grant from 1870, confirming his ownership of the property where your cabin stands. Next came several letters on military stationery, commendations for service during campaigns against hostile forces. I don't understand, Esperanza said, confusion evident in her voice. Why are these documents here instead of among my father's possessions? Father Domingo answered, Captain Garcia entrusted copies of his most important papers to the mission archives for safekeeping. Many frontier settlers did the same, fearing fire, theft, or other disasters that might destroy their only proof of property rights or identity. Thomas nodded. What your father kept with him were duplicates. These are the originals. He placed another document before her, an official-looking certificate with elaborate calligraphy. This is your parents' marriage certificate, signed by the Fort Bowie chaplain with myself and Dr. William Patterson as witnesses. The document blurred before Esperanza's eyes as unexpected tears threatened. All her life, she had known her parents, were legally married, but seeing the official proof, the signatures, the date, the formal acknowledgement of their union, affected her deeply. And this, Thomas said, his voice softening as he unfolded a final paper, is your mother's last testament, dictated to me as she faded after your birth, when it became clear she would not survive. Esperanza's hand trembled as she reached for the page. The handwriting was Thomas's, younger, less refined, but recognizably his. The words, however, came from a voice she had never heard, a presence she had known only through her father's memories. I, Nayeli of the Chiricahua people, joined in lawful marriage to Robert Garcia. Speak these words as life leaves me. The letter began. To my husband I leave my eternal devotion and the daughter who carries both our spirits. Raise her to walk proudly in both worlds, to know the strength of her mixed blood, not the shame others would place upon it. To my daughter Esperanza I leave the wisdom of my people. Though you will not know my voice or touch, you are born of a proud line of warriors and healers. The medicine pouch I carried contains symbols of protection that rightfully pass to you. When you face darkness, remember that you come from those who thrived in shadows and found paths where others saw only wilderness. To Thomas Kitson, who records these words, I entrust a sacred duty. Watch over my daughter from whatever distance life places between you. When the time comes that she must find her way beyond the boundaries others have set for her, return and guide her toward the truth of her heritage. Esperanza read the words again, then a third time, each repetition making her mother more real, more present than she had ever been through her father's loving but limited descriptions. The letter transformed Nayeli from a tragic figure into a woman of foresight and fierce maternal love, planning for her daughter's future even as her own slipped away. She knew, Esperanza whispered. Somehow she knew I would need guidance beyond what my father could provide. Thomas nodded. Your mother was a woman of remarkable perception. The Apache believe some individuals possess the gift of seeing pathways that lie ahead, though not with certainty. And you've kept this promise for 20 years? I have. His expression remained steady, but emotion deepened his voice. Though I failed in the timing, I should have returned when your father died, not years later. Father Domingo rose from his chair, joining them at the table. Our journeys rarely follow straight paths, my children. What matters is that promises made are eventually fulfilled, even if the route proves circuitous. Esperanza carefully refolded her mother's testament, feeling its weight in her hands. Not just paper, but a legacy, a connection, a map to a future she had never imagined possible. There's more I need to show you, Thomas said quietly, but not here, not today. More documents? She asked. He shook his head. No, people. Your mother's people. Some of whom survived the campaigns, the relocations, the attempts to erase their existence. They live in the mountains beyond Tucson, neither fully free nor entirely conquered, preserving what remains of the old ways. The proposition hung in the air between them, an invitation, a challenge, a door opening to a world she had never known, but whose blood ran in her veins. Why would they accept me? She asked. I'm as much Spanish as Apache. I know nothing of their language, their customs. Because your mother was Chiricahua royalty, Thomas replied simply. Her father was a respected medicine man, her brother, a war chief who fought with Geronimo. And because in their eyes, you are not half of anything, you are wholly yourself, shaped by both bloodlines, but limited by neither. Outside the archive room, mission bells rang, marking the hour. The sound resonated through the thick adobe walls, a reminder of time's passage and the weight of decisions that shape lives across generations. Esperanza looked down at the documents spread before her, tangible proof of a heritage more complex and honorable than Mesa Roja had ever acknowledged. Then she looked at Thomas, this man who had carried a promise across decades and thousands of miles to fulfill an obligation to a woman long dead and a father she had mourned for years. When would we leave? She asked, her decision made even as the question formed. After you've had time to prepare, he answered. The journey isn't short, and the destination requires commitment. Father Domingo touched her shoulder gently. Whatever you decide, child, remember that faith finds many expressions. Your path may not follow traditional tracks, but that doesn't mean it leads away from grace. Esperanza nodded, gathering the documents that had transformed her understanding of her past and perhaps her future. I need to return to the cabin to consider everything I've learned today. As they left the cool darkness of the mission for the bright afternoon heat, she felt a strange lightness despite the weight of revelation. The horizon beyond the mission stretched vast and open, the mountains in the distance blue with promise rather than forbidding with isolation. For the first time in her memory, Esperanza stood at a crossroads where all paths were hers to choose, not merely to accept. The revelation wasn't just in the documents she had seen or the history she had discovered. It was in recognizing that her story was still unfolding, still being written by her own hand. The journey began 3 days after their visit to the mission. Esperanza had used the time to put her modest affairs in order, harvesting what vegetables were ready in her small garden, giving her laying hens to an older Mexican woman on the outskirts of town who had always been kind to her, packing the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind. She brought her father's books, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Her mother's medicine pouch remained around her neck, no longer hidden, but worn openly. The documents from the mission were secured in a leather portfolio Thomas had given her. Everything else, the cabin, the land, the life she had cobbled together, on the margins of Mesa Roja, she left behind without ceremony. Sheriff Jenkins watched their departure from the steps of his office, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Sullivan stood in the doorway of the general store, lips pursed in disapproval, as Esperanza rode past on a dun mare Thomas had purchased for her. Other townspeople paused in their morning activities, observing the departure, with reactions ranging from satisfaction to vague discomfort, as though witnessing the removal of a splinter that had irritated the community's sense of order, but left an unexpected void in its wake. Only Father Domingo offered a proper farewell, blessing their journey with a prayer for safe passage. "Remember," he said to Esperanza as he made the sign of the cross, "wherever you find yourself, God sees you fully, not as half of anything, but as his complete creation." Thomas led them southeast, away from the established roads that connected settlements, following instead the ancient paths that had served indigenous travelers for centuries before European boots had touched this soil. By midday, Mesa Roja had disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. "How far to your Apache friends?" Esperanza asked, as they stopped to water the horses at a hidden spring Thomas located with unerring accuracy. 3 days if we maintain a steady pace," he replied, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading the landscape for signs of danger or opportunity. "We'll skirt the military roads and ranching operations. The territory has changed significantly since I left. More settlements, more fences, more boundaries," she observed. He nodded. "The American way, dividing the land into neat parcels. With clear ownership. The Apache way was different. Land wasn't owned. It was known, respected, traveled. And my father's way was a deed registered with the territorial government," she added, with a hint of irony. Thomas smiled slightly. "Adaptation is not surrender, Esperanza. Your father understood that surviving in changing times requires flexibility, without forsaking core principles." They continued south through increasingly rugged country, the terrain transitioning from open desert to rocky foothills. Thomas rode with the relaxed confidence of someone returning to familiar ground, occasionally pointing out landmarks or plants of medicinal value. Despite years of Eastern education and refinement, his connection to this harsh landscape remained undiminished. A native son reclaiming his birthright with each mile traversed. As dusk approached, he led them to a sheltered canyon where cottonwoods grew along a narrow stream, an oasis of green in the predominantly brown and red landscape. They made camp efficiently, Thomas gathering firewood while Esperanza arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire pit. "You're comfortable in the wilderness," he observed, as she expertly built a small, nearly smokeless fire with the techniques her father had taught her. "Captain Garcia believed every young woman should know how to survive independently," she replied. "He took me camping in these hills whenever his duties allowed, taught me to track, to find water, to recognize which plants heal and which harm. He was preparing you," Thomas noted, though perhaps he didn't realize for what. As darkness settled around them, the stars emerged with startling brilliance, uncountable points of light spanning the vault of the night sky. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling in ancient conversation. Esperanza felt a strange sense of homecoming, as though the open country had been waiting for her return all these years. "Tell me about Harvard," she said, as they ate a simple meal of jerky, beans, and hardtack softened in coffee. "Was it everything you expected?" Thomas considered the question, his face thoughtful in the firelight. It was a different kind of wilderness, one with rules so intricate they remained invisible until you violated them. The faculty acknowledged my intelligence, but viewed it as exceptional, not evidence that Apache people possess natural intellectual capacity equal to whites, but proof that I was somehow different from my savage relations. They wanted you to be the exception that proved their rule. Precisely, they celebrated my achievements as vindication of their civilizing mission, while dismissing my heritage as something to be overcome rather than honored. He added a small branch to the fire. What they never understood was that my success came not despite my Apache blood, but partially because of it. Our traditions value careful observation, strategic thinking, and adaptive response to changing conditions. All qualities that serve a scholar well. "Did you ever feel you betrayed your mother's people by embracing Western education?" she asked, giving voice to a concern that had lingered unspoken in her own mind regarding her father's Spanish and American influences. Thomas's expression remained composed, but something flashed in his eyes, a momentary glimpse of old pain quickly mastered. "Yes, frequently. I justified it by telling myself I was gathering knowledge that might eventually serve the tribe, that understanding the white man's ways would help protect Apache interests." He paused. That justification grew harder to maintain. As years passed and my connections to the tribe became increasingly remote, yet here you are, returning. "Here I am," he agreed. "Though whether I return as prodigal son or unwelcome intruder remains to be seen." They slept beneath the stars, Thomas taking the first watch as naturally as if they had traveled together for years rather than days. Esperanza drifted into sleep with unexpected ease, the ground beneath her more welcoming than her narrow bed in Mesa Roja had ever been. The landscape changed dramatically on the second day. They climbed steadily into the mountains, following game trails through stands of pine and juniper. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of resin and damp earth. Water became more plentiful, bubbling from rock faces in clear springs, or flowing in streams that carved ancient channels through the stone. Thomas pointed out signs of wildlife that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. A cougar's territorial, scratching on a pine trunk, the distinct tracks of a black bear with cubs, the disturbed earth where a family of javelinas had rooted for tubers. He moved through the forest with heightened awareness, showing Esperanza how to recognize areas recently visited by humans. A bent twig here, a displaced stone there, marks meaningless to settlers but clear as signposts to those who knew how to read them. "The Apache way of moving through the world leaves little trace," he explained as they paused to rest the horses in a high meadow dotted with wildflowers. "Our people could travel hundreds of miles, entire bands with women, children, and elders, yet leave so little evidence of their passing that experienced army scouts would lose the trail." "My father mentioned something similar," Esperanza recalled. "He said Apache warriors could appear and vanish like spirits, making conventional military tactics almost useless against them." Thomas nodded. The army eventually realized that fighting Apache meant learning from Apache. They recruited native scouts, adopted more flexible formations, studied the terrain from an indigenous perspective. When they couldn't defeat the Apache way, they incorporated elements of it. Is that what happened to you at Harvard? Did you incorporate their ways while maintaining your core identity? He glanced at her with appreciation for the insightful question. That was my intention. The reality proved more complicated. Immersion in another culture changes you, whether you wish it or not. The challenge is recognizing those changes and consciously choosing which to accept, which to resist, which to transform into something new. They continued higher into the mountains, the horses picking their way carefully along increasingly narrow trails. By late afternoon, they had reached an overlook that commanded a breathtaking view of the valley below, a patchwork of forest, meadow, and rocky outcropping that stretched for miles before giving way to the distant desert. "We're being watched," Thomas said quietly, not altering his relaxed posture or raising his voice. "Have been for the past hour." Esperanza managed not to start or look around frantically. "Apache?" "Yes. Guardian Scouts. They're evaluating whether we represent a threat before allowing us closer to the encampment. What should we do?" "Exactly. What we are doing. Continue normally. They know me, or at least know of me. They're likely more curious about you." He dismounted smoothly, stretching as if merely tired from the long ride. "We'll make camp here. Tonight will determine whether we're invited to continue or politely encouraged to turn back." They established their camp with deliberate efficiency, acting as though unaware of hidden observers, while subtly demonstrating peaceful intentions. Thomas built the fire larger than necessary for their needs, a signal of openness rather than concealment. He arranged their supplies to show they carried no weapons beyond a hunting rifle and knife. Esperanza followed his lead, moving with calm purpose, occasionally speaking to her horse in the mix of Spanish and English that felt natural to her. As darkness fell, Thomas produced a small wooden flute from his saddlebag. The instrument was simply carved, weathered by years of handling. "My mother made this," he explained, running his fingers over the smooth surface. "I carried it with me to Boston, to Cambridge, to London and Paris. It remained my one constant connection to this land." He raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody was unlike anything Esperanza had heard before, not a distinct tune, but a flowing organic sound that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself. The notes rose and fell like wind, through canyon walls, like water over stone, like distant thunder preceding summer rain. It was music that belonged to this place, that had been shaped by generations of listening to the voice of the land and responding in kind. Esperanza closed her eyes, allowing the haunting sounds to wash over her. Something stirred within her blood, a recognition beyond conscious memory, as though some part of her had been waiting all her life to hear exactly these notes in exactly this place. When Thomas finally lowered the flute, the silence seemed to vibrate with lingering echoes. He placed the instrument carefully beside him and looked toward the darkness beyond their fire. "Grandfather," he said simply, speaking now in Apache, "I have returned as promised, bringing the daughter of Nayeli." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly man wrapped in a blanket despite the mild evening temperature. His face was deeply lined, his hair silver-white and braided with hawk feathers. He carried a gnarled wooden staff adorned with symbols Esperanza recognized from her mother's medicine pouch. Two younger men flanked him, alert and wary, hands resting on rifle butts but not yet threatening. Their expressions remained carefully neutral as they assessed the visitors. The elder spoke in Apache, his voice surprisingly strong despite his apparent age. Thomas replied respectfully, occasionally gesturing toward Esperanza. Though she couldn't understand the words, she recognized her mother's name, Nayeli, mentioned several times in their exchange. Finally, Thomas turned to her. "Esperanza, this is Ascado Dilges, he who speaks with thunder. He is a medicine man of the Chiricahua band and was your mother's uncle. He remembers her well and has been waiting for your return." "My return?" she echoed, confused. "I've never been here before." Thomas translated her words. The old man studied her face intently before speaking again. "He says, 'You have been here in spirit since your birth,'" Thomas translated, "that your mother's blood calls to these mountains, regardless of where your body has lived." The elder approached slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When he stood before her, he raised a weathered hand and gently touched her cheek. The gesture carried such unexpected tenderness that Esperanza felt tears rising unbidden. He spoke again, this time directly to her, though she couldn't understand the words. "He welcomes you as daughter of the Strong Rope clan," Thomas explained. "He says your mother's spirit has guided your path back to your people, and that it is good you have come before the old knowledge fades completely." The old man gestured for them to follow, turning without waiting for agreement. The younger men moved to flank them as they gathered their essentials and doused the fire. Leaving the horses ground-tied, they would be collected later, Thomas explained. They followed the small party along a nearly invisible trail that wound deeper into the forested mountainside. After 20 minutes of silent walking, they emerged into a hidden valley nestled between steep cliffs. A cluster of traditional Apache wickiups stood alongside more permanent wooden structures, a blending of ancient and adapted housing that reflected the reality of their circumstances. Several cooking fires dotted the encampment, around which sat perhaps 30 people of various ages. Their arrival caused a stir. Women paused in their work, children stopped their play, men rose from where they had been repairing equipment or preparing hides. All eyes turned to assess the newcomers, particularly Esperanza, whose mixed features and clothing marked her as neither fully Apache nor fully European. Ascadodilges spoke to the gathered community, his voice carrying authority despite its age. He gestured toward Thomas, then more emphatically toward Esperanza. As he spoke, Esperanza noticed the expressions around them shifting from wariness to curiosity, from suspicion to cautious acceptance. An elderly woman approached, her face as lined as the medicine man's, but her posture still straight and proud. She walked directly to Esperanza and took both her hands, studying her face with keen eyes before nodding once in apparent confirmation of something she had expected to see. "This is Nada Hende, she who walks through fire," Thomas explained. "She was your mother's aunt and helped bring you into the world." Esperanza struggled to comprehend. "She was at my birth, in the fort?" Thomas nodded. "Many details of your early life were kept from you, necessarily your father believed, to protect you in a world growing increasingly hostile to mixed heritage. After your mother died, several of her relatives remained near the fort for months, watching over you from a distance." The elderly woman spoke, her voice surprisingly melodic despite her age. "She says you have your mother's eyes and your father's chin," Thomas translated. "She says your spirit has been wandering too long between worlds and must now be welcomed home properly." Led by Nada Hende, Esperanza was brought to a large wickiup at the center of the encampment. Inside, several women of various ages had gathered. They motioned for her to sit on a beautifully woven blanket while they arranged themselves in a circle around her. Thomas remained outside with the men, explaining that certain ceremonies were conducted solely by the women of the tribe. "Don't worry," he assured her. "This is a welcoming ritual, a reintroduction to the feminine wisdom of your mother's people. You are being honored, not tested." The ceremony that followed transcended the barriers of language. The women sang songs in Apache that stirred something deep within Esperanza's blood. They passed a clay bowl of water infused with herbs for her to drink. They brushed her hair with careful hands, weaving small decorative bands of red and white. Thread into several strands, markers of her lineage, Esperanza somehow understood. Though no one had explained their significance aloud, Nadahende placed both hands on Esperanza's shoulders, looking deeply into her eyes, while speaking words that needed no translation to convey their meaning. You belong here. You are of us. Your journey home is complete. When they finally emerged from the wickiup, night had fully descended. The encampment was illuminated by fires that cast dancing shadows against the surrounding pines. Thomas stood with Ascadodilges and several other men, deep in conversation that ceased when they appeared. Seeing her, Thomas smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his usually composed features. "You look like your mother," he said simply. Esperanza touched the small, decorative threads now woven into her hair. "They've accepted me so easily. How is that possible, when I know nothing of their ways, their language, their history?" "Because blood remembers what the mind forgets," Ascadodilges said in halting Spanish, surprising her. "Daughter of Nayeli, your mother's spirit watches over you. Now you must learn what was kept from you." The community gathered for an evening meal around the central fire. Esperanza was seated in a place of honor next to Nadahende, who kept a protective hand on her arm, as though afraid she might disappear if not anchored to the earth. Various dishes were shared: stewed meat with chiles, roasted desert vegetables, bread made from ground mesquite pods, and cornmeal. The flavors were both foreign and strangely familiar, as though her body recognized nourishment her conscious mind had never experienced. Throughout the meal, people approached to look at her, especially the elders who had known her mother. Some touched her hair or hands gently, murmuring in Apache. Others simply studied her features, nodding in satisfaction at the clear inheritance of Nayeli's bloodline. Thomas sat across the fire, conversing easily in Apache with the men. Occasionally he would catch her eye and translate particularly important comments, but mostly he allowed her to experience the moment without mediation, to feel rather than intellectually understand her welcome. As the meal concluded, Ascadodilges raised his voice, addressing the gathered community. The tone was formal, ceremonial. Thomas listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. When the elder finished speaking, a murmur ran through the assembled group. Thomas rose and approached Esperanza. "He has made an announcement of significance," he explained, quietly. "He says that your return fulfills a prophecy made at your birth, that the divided blood would return to restore balance when most needed. He believes your arrival is timely, as the tribe faces a new threat from government agents, seeking to force the remaining free bands onto reservations." "What could I possibly do to help with such a situation?" Esperanza asked, bewildered. "I have no influence, no power." Thomas's expression was grave. "He believes you do, though not in the conventional sense. Your existence, the daughter of both worlds, educated in Western ways but carrying Apache blood, represents a possibility for bridge building that might protect the remaining freedom of these people." "That's why you brought me here," she realized, suddenly, "not just to fulfill a promise to my father, but because my very existence serves some larger purpose for the tribe." "Your father's promise and the tribe's need converged," Thomas acknowledged, "but never doubt that my primary obligation was to you, to ensure you discovered the full truth of your heritage and had the opportunity to claim all aspects of your identity." Around them, the community began preparing for sleep, banking fires, and returning to wickiups. Nadahende led Esperanza to a small shelter prepared specifically for her, a traditional structure, but furnished with both Apache bedding and a European-style blanket, a thoughtful accommodation of her dual heritage. As she settled onto the surprisingly comfortable bed of pine boughs covered with soft hides, Esperanza felt a profound sense of dislocation, not because this place was strange, but because it felt inexplicably familiar, like returning to a home she had never known she had lost. Outside, the nightbirds called, their voices blending with the soft murmur of the mountain stream that ran through the valley. Beyond the sheltering cliffs, the vast territory stretched in all directions, a land contested by nations and peoples, each claiming ownership through different means and traditions. Somewhere in that complex landscape, Esperanza realized, as sleep began to claim her, lay the answer to who she truly was and who she might become. Not Spanish, not Apache, not American, but something new, forged from all three traditions yet bound by none. The journey had brought her to her mother's people, but her true path was just beginning to reveal itself. Esperanza had been with the Apache community for nearly 3 weeks when the messenger arrived. She had settled into a rhythm of daily life that felt increasingly natural, rising with the sun, learning traditional skills from Nadahende and the other women, studying the Apache language with determined concentration. Each day brought new discoveries about her mother's people and by extension about herself. The messenger, a young Apache man riding a lathered horse, arrived at midday, bringing news that spread through the encampment like wildfire. Thomas found Esperanza by the stream, where she was learning to prepare traditional dyes from plant materials under Nadahende's instruction. "Government Indian agents are in Mesa Roja," he said without preamble. "They're asking questions about renegade Apache in the mountains. Sheriff Jenkins has apparently mentioned our departure and suggested a connection." Nadahende's weathered face showed no alarm, but her hands stilled their work. Though she spoke little English, she understood enough to grasp the implications. She said something in Apache to Thomas, her voice steady. "She says this was foreseen," Thomas translated. "The elders have been expecting increased pressure. The government wants all Apache on the San Carlos reservation where they can be controlled. Counted, converted. What will happen?" Esperanza asked, wiping plant-stained hands on her apron, a garment gifted to her by one of the women, decorated with traditional geometric patterns. "Ascado Dilges has called a council. We're both requested to attend." His expression was grave. "This band has avoided forced relocation thus far by remaining hidden and maintaining friendly relations with certain influential ranchers who value their occasional labor and tracking skills. But official policy is hardening. The government wants to draw clear lines, reservation or outlaw, with no middle ground permitted." The council gathered in the largest structure in the encampment, a circular wooden building used for community decisions and ceremonies. The space was arranged with the eldest and most respected members seated in an inner circle. Younger adults forming a second ring, with observers standing against the walls. As a medicine man, Ascadodilges occupied a position of honor, with Nadahende beside him, representing the wisdom of the women. Esperanza and Tomas were directed to seats in the inner circle, a significant honor that recognized their importance to the current discussion. Thomas's familiarity with government procedures and legal language made him valuable, while Esperanza's unique position as daughter of both worlds gave her insights neither full Apache nor full European might possess. The council began with ritual, smoking of a sacred pipe, followed by the messenger's detailed report. The Indian agents, 3 men accompanied by a military escort of 6 soldiers, had established themselves at the Mesa Roja Hotel. They were showing photographs of known Apache leaders and offering rewards for information leading to the location of non-reservation hostiles. They claimed authority under new federal directives to compel all remaining free Apache to relocate to San Carlos. "San Carlos is a place of death," one elder stated flatly after the report concluded. "The water is bad. Diseases spread quickly. Different bands who were traditionally enemies are forced together. Those who go there fade like leaves in winter." Others nodded agreement. San Carlos Reservation had developed a grim reputation, a place where proud Apache were transformed into dependent wards, where traditional skills and knowledge withered, where government rations were often insufficient or spoiled. What alternatives exist? Thomas asked, speaking in Apache out of respect for the elders who weren't comfortable with English. This valley has remained secure because few outsiders know of its existence. But if they're actively searching now, with military support, discovery becomes increasingly likely. An older warrior named Kianata spoke next. We could move deeper into the mountains. There are places even government scouts cannot easily find. For how long? Countered a younger man. Each year, more of the territory is mapped, more settlers arrive, more forests are cut for mining operations. Where is this place we can hide forever? The discussion continued, options evaluated and discarded. Fighting was briefly considered, but quickly rejected. The small band numbered fewer than 50, including elders and children, against the massive resources of the U.S. government. Surrender to reservation life was similarly dismissed. Relocation to even more remote regions seemed only a temporary solution. Throughout the debate, Ascadodilges remained largely silent, occasionally closing his eyes as if consulting internal wisdom. When he finally spoke, the room fell immediately. "Quiet! The old ways are passing," he said, his voice carrying the weight of difficult truth. Not because they have failed, but because the world around us has changed beyond recognition. Our ancestors could not have imagined the steel roads that bring thousands of new people to our lands, the talking wires that carry messages faster than the fastest horse, the weapons that kill from distances greater than an arrow can fly. He looked around the circle, his gaze finally settling on Esperanza. But the blood remembers. The spirit endures, even when mixed with other bloods, even when the tongue forgets our words, even when the hands no longer practice our crafts. Something remains, waiting to be awakened. Thomas translated carefully, ensuring Esperanza understood the nuances of the elder's speech. The daughter of Nayeli carries two worlds within her, Ascadodilges continued, not divided, but united. This is why her return was prophesied, not to save us as we were, that time has passed, but to help create what we might become. Esperanza felt the weight of expectations settling on her shoulders. "I don't understand what you're asking of me," she said, Thomas translating her words. "Into Apache, I've only just begun to learn your ways. How can I possibly help with such a monumental challenge?" Nadahenda spoke then, her voice strong despite her years. "You bridge worlds without belonging fully to either. This is not weakness but strength. You see with clear eyes what others cannot because of their single perspective." The conversation shifted then, becoming more practical. Various council members offered insights about the Indian agents, their likely tactics, their authority, their weaknesses. Thomas contributed knowledge of legal frameworks and political considerations. Throughout, Esperanza listened carefully, gradually forming an understanding of what might be possible. Near the end of the council, she finally spoke. "The government wants all Apache on reservations because they fear what they cannot control. But what if there were a way to satisfy their need for control while preserving the essence of Apache identity and autonomy?" Thomas translated, adding, "She thinks like both her mother and her father, practical yet principled." Esperanza outlined a bold proposition, drawing on elements from various council members' suggestions while adding her own insights. As Thomas translated her words, expressions around the circle shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. When the council concluded near sunset, a consensus had formed around Esperanza's proposal. It was not perfect, not a complete victory, but in a world of increasingly limited options, it offered a path forward that preserved dignity and possibility. "It will require courage of a different kind," Thomas observed as they walked from the council lodge together. "Not the warrior's courage to face enemies in battle, but the visionary's courage to imagine and create a future different from both." Past and present. Will they trust me to represent them? Esperanza asked, still uncertain of her standing despite the respect shown during the council. They trust what they see in you, Nayeli's strength and your father's strategic mind, combined with something entirely your own. He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to undertake this responsibility. She didn't answer immediately, looking instead toward the mountains that cradled this hidden community, mountains that had witnessed centuries of Apache life before European arrival, mountains that would remain long after. Current conflicts were settled or forgotten. I've spent my life caught between worlds, she said finally. Perhaps that was preparation for this moment, not a burden to be overcome, but a gift to be utilized. Thomas nodded, something like pride softening his usually composed expression. Tomorrow we ride to Mesa Roja. Tonight there will be a ceremony to prepare your spirit for the challenge ahead. The ceremonial fire burned high, sending sparks toward the star-filled sky. Around it, the community had gathered to witness Esperanza's preparation for her difficult mission. Women had dressed her in a traditional buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, while Nada Hende had arranged her hair in a style that honored both her Apache and European heritage. Partly braided with decorative elements, partly flowing free, Ascadodilges conducted the ceremony with measured dignity, calling upon ancestral spirits to guide and protect the daughter of Nayeli as she ventured into uncertain territory. He painted symbolic designs on her forehead and hands with red ochre, marks of courage, wisdom, and clear speech. During one portion of the ritual, Thomas was called forward. To Esperanza's surprise, he too received ceremonial markings, recognition of his role not merely as translator, but as her shield-bearer, responsible for supporting her mission while ensuring her physical safety. The community sang songs of power and protection, voices blending in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones beneath their feet. Children brought small gifts, a perfectly formed feather, a smooth river stone, a tiny pouch of sacred pollen, each item carrying symbolic significance for her journey. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Nada Hende approached with a final gift, a necklace of silver and turquoise that had once belonged to Nayeli. The elderly woman placed it around Esperanza's neck, with hands that trembled slightly from age, but moved with ceremonial precision. Your mother wore this when she left our people to follow her heart, Thomas translated Nada Hende's words. Now, her daughter wears it to help save what remains of our way of life. The circle completes itself. That night, Esperanza slept little, her mind filled with the enormity of the task ahead. By dawn, however, her resolve had crystallized into determination. She dressed in clothing that represented her dual heritage, a practical riding skirt and jacket of European design, but with her mother's necklace prominently displayed and her hair arranged in the style Nada Hende had taught her. Thomas, similarly, balanced his presentation, Eastern-cut jacket and trousers, but with Apache-style moccasins and a medicine pouch visible at his belt. Together, they embodied the bridge they hoped to build, not through erasure of difference, but through respectful integration. The ride to Mesa Roja took a full day, following established trails rather than the hidden paths they had used when departing. They arrived as evening shadows lengthened across the main street, their appearance causing immediate stir among the townspeople who had thought Esperanza gone for good. The Indian agents had established temporary office in the town hall, a fact confirmed by the military horses tethered outside and the bored-looking soldiers lounging on the building's steps. Thomas and Esperanza rode directly there, making no attempt to conceal their arrival. Sheriff Jenkins emerged from his office as they dismounted, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. Miss Garcia, Mr. Redhawk, didn't expect to see either of you back in Mesa Roja. "We've come on official business, Sheriff," Thomas replied formally. "We request an immediate meeting with the Indian Affairs representatives." Jenkins studied them both, noting their deliberate presentation of dual heritage. They've been asking about Apache hiding in the mountains, mentioned rewards for information. "We're well aware," Thomas said, "which is precisely why we're here." Inside the town hall, 3 government agents sat at a makeshift desk covered with maps and documents. They looked up with professional alertness as Jenkins ushered in the unexpected visitors. "Gentlemen," the sheriff announced, "this here's Thomas Redhawk, Harvard-educated, if you can believe it, and Miss Esperanza Garcia. They've got some business with you regarding your Apache situation." The lead agent, a thin man with a meticulously trimmed beard and wire-rimmed spectacles, rose to his feet. "Bernard Halloway, Bureau of Indian Affairs. These individuals have information about non-reservation Apache?" "Not exactly," Thomas replied, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced. "As it often did in official settings, I represent a community of peaceful Apache currently residing in the Dragoon Mountains. Miss Garcia serves as special liaison between this community and territorial authorities." Halloway's eyebrows rose. "Indeed? And by what authority does Miss Garcia claim this liaison position?" "By right of birth and heritage," Esperanza answered directly, before Thomas could speak for her. "My mother was Chiricahua Apache, my father a captain in the United States Army. I stand between worlds by blood and by choice." Her directness seemed to momentarily confound the agent, who had clearly not expected to address a woman, particularly a mixed-blood woman, as an equal negotiating partner. He recovered quickly, however, professional training overcoming personal prejudice. "Please be seated," he invited, gesturing to chairs across from the agent's table. "I'm intrigued by this unexpected development. What followed was the most consequential negotiation of Esperanza's life. Drawing on Thomas's legal knowledge, her father's military strategic thinking, and the wisdom shared during the Apache Council, she presented a carefully structured proposal, not a surrender, but a framework for coexistence that might satisfy government requirements while preserving essential Apache autonomy. The community would formally register with territorial authorities, providing a census and maintaining regular communication with designated officials. In exchange, they would receive legal recognition of their right to remain in their current location rather than relocating to San Carlos. The government's concern is primarily about uncontrolled hostiles representing military threat, Esperanza argued. This community consists largely of elders, women and children, with a few hunters who have never participated in raids or warfare against settlers. Even peaceful Apache are required to reside on established reservations under current policy. Halloway countered. Thomas leaned forward. True, but Article 6 of the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, while focused primarily on the Navajo, established precedent for designated enclaves outside reservation boundaries under special circumstances. There's also the Hunter Amendment to the Indian Appropriations Act, which grants the Bureau discretionary authority in cases involving unique cultural or historical considerations. The legal references, some legitimate, some creatively interpreted, gave Halloway pause. "You're remarkably well versed in Indian affairs legislative frameworks, Mr. Redhawk." "Harvard law does have its advantages," Thomas replied with calculated modesty, "as does 3 years working under Commissioner Atkins in Washington." The negotiation continued past midnight, details refined, compromises crafted, boundaries established. Throughout, Esperanza demonstrated surprising diplomatic skill, knowing when to press a point, when to concede, when to allow silence to create pressure for response. The Apache Council's wisdom guided her strategy, while her father's military training informed her tactical decisions. By dawn, an agreement had taken shape, imperfect but viable. The Apache community would gain legal protection from forced relocation in exchange for formal registration and periodic government inspection. They would retain hunting rights in designated areas while agreeing not to interfere with legitimate mining operations or settlements. Most importantly, they would be permitted to establish a small school where their children could learn both traditional knowledge and basic English literacy, creating a generation capable of navigating both worlds. While maintaining cultural continuity, this arrangement is highly irregular, Holloway admitted, as he affixed his signature to the final document. I'll need to defend it vigorously to my superiors in Washington. You're welcome to emphasize the cost savings compared to forced relocation, Thomas suggested. Military operations are expensive, peaceful administration much less so. And you may note that this establishes a potential model for other non-hostile bands, Esperanza added. One that achieves government objectives without bloodshed or additional military expenditure. Holloway studied her with newfound respect. You're a most unusual woman, Miss Garcia. I begin to understand why this community selected you as their representative. As they departed the town hall into the bright morning light, exhausted but triumphant, Esperanza felt a profound shift within herself, as though pieces of identity that had long existed in uncomfortable tension had finally aligned into coherent wholeness. Mesa Roja looked different to her now, not because the town had changed, but because she had. The buildings, the streets, the people going about their morning routines, all remained as before. Yet her relationship to this place had transformed. Fundamentally, no longer was she a marginalized outsider seeking acceptance. She was a woman with purpose, connected to a community that valued her precisely because of her mixed heritage, rather than despite it. What happens now? She asked Thomas. As they collected their horses from the livery, we return to the mountains with news of what's been achieved, he replied. The agreement isn't perfect. The government will still exercise oversight. Boundaries will limit traditional movement patterns. Cultural practices will need to adapt. But they'll survive, she completed the thought. Not unchanged, but unbroken. Yes, he secured his saddle with practiced efficiency. And beyond that immediate victory lies a greater challenge, creating a sustainable future that honors the essential spirit of Apache ways while acknowledging the realities of a changing world. As they rode out of Mesa Roja, Esperanza noticed Sheriff Jenkins watching from the steps of his office. She acknowledged him with a dignified nod, not seeking approval, merely recognizing their shared humanity despite past conflicts. To her mild surprise, he returned the gesture with what might have been reluctant respect. They followed the road for several miles before turning onto the trail that would lead them back to the mountain community. As they climbed steadily upward, the vista expanded behind them, the town growing smaller in perspective, the vast landscape stretching toward distant horizons. My father once told me that mixed blood wasn't half of each world, but twice the responsibility, Esperanza said as they paused to rest the horses near a highland spring. I didn't understand him then. Thomas dismounted, leading his horse to water. And now I see that standing between worlds creates opportunity as well as challenge. The ability to translate not just language but perspectives, to build connections where others see only divisions. He nodded thoughtfully. There's an Apache saying, the path is made by walking. Your path has been neither purely Apache nor purely European, but something new, something needed in these changing times. Esperanza touched her mother's necklace, feeling its weight. Against her skin, a tangible connection to a heritage she was only beginning to fully understand. When I was a child in Mesa Roja, I dreamed of belonging somewhere, of finding a place where I wasn't marked as different or less. And now, She looked toward the mountains where her mother's people awaited their return, then back toward the valley where her father's world continued its inexorable expansion. Now I understand that my place isn't in one world or the other, but in the space between, the space where bridges can be built, where understanding can grow, where different bloods can mix to create something stronger than either alone could be. Thomas mounted his horse, his expression holding something she hadn't seen before, a quiet pride, a recognition of shared purpose. Then let's continue the journey. There's much work ahead, and many paths yet to be made by walking. Together, they rode higher into the mountains, toward a future neither completely Apache, nor European, nor American, but uniquely their own. A future born from the courage to stand proudly at the crossroads of conflicting worlds and forge connections where others saw only divisions. Behind them, the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows, a moment of perfect balance between past and future, between heritage and possibility, between who they had been and who they were becoming. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.